Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I know you all have a lot to do. There's a lot going on. So we really appreciate you carving out time in your busy schedules today. So today we're going to talk about HOTMA for HOPWA, particularly the implementation of HOTMA sections 102 and 104. Some quick housekeeping. Everyone always likes to ask. So the presentation slide, a transcript, and a recording of today's presentation will be posted to the HUD Exchange. That normally occurs in about a week or two. An announcement about these materials being posted will be sent. So just stay tuned to your email and you'll be the first to know as soon as you receive that email. Because of the large number of participants, all participants are muted. So what we're going to ask for everyone is please continue to use the chat to introduce yourself, what community you're from, what you do for the HOPWA program, and any other important identifying information about yourself. But any questions that you'd like to ask about today, about the material, about HOPWA, please make sure to put into the Q&A. Questions that are submitted under the chat function are usually not seen and therefore we can't address them. So please make sure to use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you would like addressed. With that being said, we may not be able to answer all of your questions today, but we do encourage you to submit any questions. As you'll see during today's presentation, there's some materials that will be answered at a future date. And just because of the number of participants, we may not have a lot of time for a lot of Q&A at the end of today's presentation. But we still strongly encourage you to submit those questions in the Q&A, as that will help drive future webinars, future office hours, and future TA tools that are published. For today's presenters, as well as helping in the Q&A from the Office of HIV Housing, we have Amy Palalonis, Lisa Steinhauer, and Jennifer Mullen. From the Cloudburst Group, you have myself, and you also have Heather Rhoda here to walk you through today's presentation. Before we begin with anything today, I want to turn the slides over to Amy as she has some opening remarks.
Thanks, Steve. And hello, everyone. I just want to thank you all for joining us today as we discuss the final rule implementing HOTMA sections 102, 103, and 104 and their applicability to the HOPWA program. This webinar is just the very beginning of our conversation about HOTMA sections 102 and 104 for HOPWA. These sections of the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act made changes affecting income calculation, reviews, and program eligibility, and revised HOPWA regulations at 24 CFR Part 574 to conform with new income and asset provisions. This webinar is really going to be limited to the information provided in the final rule. Once OHH publishes an implementation notice for this final rule, we will share a lot more guidance and resources about how to operationalize these new requirements. As Steve mentioned, our ability to answer specific questions about implementation or provide detailed information about the requirements will be limited today. That is for a variety of reasons, but mainly because OHH must publish that implementation notice that I just mentioned to flesh out HOPWA specific requirements and guidance. So really the purpose of today's webinar is just to alert you all to these upcoming changes, make sure that you know where to find the final rule and other relevant information, and provide a high-level overview of the rule. Right now, we are seeing many new laws and regulations shifting requirements for the HOPWA program, such as the INSPIRE inspection requirements, the new carbon monoxide requirements, and HOTMA. And we know many of you are extremely busy and may be feeling worried or overwhelmed about the implications for your work. Over the next several months, we in OHH, in partnership with our TA providers, will be rolling out guidance, webinars, and tools and products to ensure that you have the information you need to successfully implement these new requirements. And you can always ask questions through the AAQ portal or request TA support in understanding these new requirements. But as Steve said, even if we can't get to your questions today, it's really important that you still submit them through that Q&A box so that they will inform the future guidance and resources that we will be putting out on HOTMA 102, 104. So I just want to thank everyone on this webinar for your continued work to meet the housing needs of people living with HIV in your communities, and for joining us today to learn more about HOTMA sections 102 and 104 and how they apply to the HOPWA program. So I will now turn things back over to Heather and Steve.
Thank you, Amy. So before we get going on today's presentation further, let's engage you all in a quick poll. So you all are going to see a poll question wanting to know, had you heard about HOTMA before the webinar announcement that you received for this, as well as today's webinar? And if yes, can you tell us where you heard about HOTMA? We'll give people a little bit of time to answer that. Because it is a short answer, we won't be able to reveal the results live. But once again, it's just useful information to see where you all are collecting information about webinars and office hours and things that are published. So we really appreciate you taking the time to answer this. Plus, it's making sure that you've logged on and you're paying attention for all of the exciting HOTMA materials that are coming very soon.
Right. I'm looking at this ticking up, Steve, and I can see that a lot of people are responding to this poll question.
Absolutely.
So that's much appreciated. Because like Steve said, this can also help us, figure out, some information needed for further TA, and also where you're finding that information.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to give it just a few more seconds and I will end the poll. And then we will jump right into what everyone came here for, the main event. All right, thank you, everyone. With that, Heather, why don't you take us in?
Sure. So the purpose of today's webinar, as Steve and Amy mentioned, is to provide high-level answers to a few questions. First of all, we're going to talk about what is HOTMA and what does this acronym stand for. We're also going to talk about and answer the question, what does section 102 of HOTMA mean and how does it apply to HOPWA, as well as what does section 104 mean and how does it apply to HOPWA. We're also going to discuss with you and answer questions about some additional changes caused by HOTMA and how they apply to the HOPWA program. We're also going to answer questions about changes to definitions in the HOPWA final rule and how those apply to HOTMA. And we're also going to discuss and answer questions for HOPWA grantees and project sponsors. How can we all begin to prepare your HOPWA program, our HOPWA program, for these HOTMA changes? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa from OHH.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Steinhauer with HUD's Office of HIV/AIDS Housing. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to kick us off with what is HOTMA. So the Housing Opportunity through Modernization Act of 2016 is what we refer to as HOTMA. This is a public law enacted on July 29, 2016. HOTMA made numerous changes to statutes governing HUD programs, including HOPWA. For example, we have already seen some of the changes under HOTMA take effect for the HOPWA program through statutory changes for formula modernization that changed the way HOPWA formula funding was distributed. This was a very specific change. This was a HOPWA specific change in HOTMA, but the law was very big, and many of the statutory provisions in HOTMA were intended to streamline administrative processes under HUD, across HUD programs. While some of these statutory changes made by HOTMA could be implemented immediately, other changes under HOTMA required HUD to take action through the rulemaking process. A quick note, while HOTMA immediately implemented changes for HOPWA formula modernization through a statutory change, HUD does still need to go through the rulemaking process to update the HOPWA program regulations based on those statutory changes. And I'm sure many of you have already heard us say numerous times that this is coming soon. But back to sections 102, 103, and 104 of HOTMA, which is why we are here today. These sections required HUD to make changes to its regulations due to the statutory changes to the United States Housing Act of 1937, particularly those affecting income and asset provisions. HUD has made it through the rulemaking process for these sections, and it was a long journey. So on September 17th, 2019, HUD issued a proposed rule to update its regulations according to HOTMA's statutory mandate and to implement the provisions of sections 102, 103, and 104. This proposed rule solicited public comment on the regulatory updates HUD was proposing. And at the conclusion of that public comment period, HUD addressed the public comments and went through a series of governmental reviews to then publish a final rule. So HUD issued this final rule on the implementation of HOTMA sections 102, 103, and 104 on February 14th, 2023, which is the impetus for all of us being here today. The final rule streamlines requirements across many HUD programs through the changed income regulatory provisions in 24 CFR Part 5, and revises the program regulations for several HUD programs, including HOPWA regulations at 24 CFR Part 574. This final rule is effective on January 1st, 2024 for the HOPWA program. And just to clarify, only sections 102 and 104 of the HOTMA final rule apply to the HOPWA program. A link to that final rule can be seen at the bottom of the slide here. Next slide, please. All right, so what are sections 102 and 104 of HOTMA? Sections 102 and 104 of the HOTMA final rule modify the rules for determining household income and assets in multiple HUD programs, as mentioned. And this includes public housing, Section 8, sections 202 and 811, HOPWA, home, and housing trust fund programs. This means that each of these programs have adopted conforming regulations through the final rule. And if we are looking specifically at HOPWA, the regulations governing the HOPWA program at 24 CFR 574 will change as written in the final rule when it becomes effective on January 1st, 2024. And the changes made through sections 102 and 104 affect income reviews, both initial and annual income eligibility determinations, resident rent payments, asset limitations, day-to-day functions related to delivering HOPWA rental assistance activities, and quite a few other things that we are going to discuss in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So how did we get here and where are we going? So as we discussed, HOTMA 2016, this is where we all started when the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act, or HOTMA, was signed into law on July 29, 2016. We moved down to the final rule, HOTMA implementation of sections 102, 103, and 104. And so HUD then went through the rulemaking process due to the statutory changes made through HOTMA and issued a final rule on February 14th, 2023. We move down to HOPWA regulations at 24 CFR Part 574. And these, the final rule updates HUD regulations at 24 CFR Part 5 and also revises the HOPWA regulations at 24 CFR 574 to conform with the updates made through the final rule. The final rule, again, is effective on January 1st, 2024. And that is when the revisions will be included in the HOPWA program regulations. You've heard mentioned a few times the HOPWA implementation notice, which is coming soon. And so HUD's work does not stop at updating the regulations for sections 102 and 104. The office that I work in, the HUD Office of HIV/AIDS Housing, will also be publishing an implementation notice that provides guidance to HOPWA grantees and project sponsors on how to implement and operationalize the regulatory changes made through the final rule. The implementation will be coming soon, along with plenty of technical assistance and resources to support you getting into compliance with these new requirements. And this last piece of where we are going, HOPWA grantee policies and procedures updated. And so finally, we want to make sure to acknowledge that HOTMA sections 102 and 104 changes will require some significant updates to HOPWA policies and procedures at the grantee level. The implementation notice will be providing guidance on all regulatory changes that require updates to policies and procedures and highlight areas that require grantees to determine how to implement the new requirements within their HOPWA program. So there will be decision-making points for all the HOPWA programs. No action is needed right now on policies and procedures for HOTMA sections 102 and 104 final rule, but they are coming and we are in the process of preparing guidance to support you. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to my colleagues at Cloudburst, Heather and Steve, or I think just Heather.
Thank you, Lisa. So that was definitely a lot of information. So we just want to remind everybody that, remember, today's presentation is meant to provide a summary, high-level overview of how HOTMA will affect the HOPWA program. So do not make any changes to your HOPWA program policies today based on the HOTMA final rule and what we're discussing. As Lisa said, HUD will be issuing a HOPWA implementation notice that will include additional information and guidance pertaining to HOPWA requirements associated with updating your HOPWA program policies and procedures. So next slide. So here are a summary. This chart represents a summary of the HOPWA changes and the changes that do apply to HOPWA itself. In this first column, you'll notice the HOTMA change itself, and there are things like net family assets, annual income definition, along with the citation and the regulation that will be changing. In the second column indicates whether the HOTMA change is or isn't applicable to the HOPWA program. So for instance, if you take a look at the HOTMA change annual income definition, in the second column, you'll see yes, the definition of annual income changed in the HOTMA rule is applicable to the HOPWA program. And there is also an indication of where in the HOPWA rule it will be applicable to. We're not going to go through every single one of these in this chart specifically, because we are touching on most of all of these throughout the presentation. But we thought that this chart would be a great summarizing tool and sort of a cheat sheet to refer back to. Next slide, please. So let's get down to it, right? So here we were talking about the two sections in the HOTMA final rule that apply to HOPWA. So we're saying HOTMA, HOPWA. So as we've been doing some work on that, we've kind of been stumbling back and forth on saying HOTMA and HOPWA. But nevertheless, in the section, we're going to talk about section 102 of the HOTMA final rule. Next slide. What types of information is included in section 102? In summary, section 102 includes information about income reviews, such as interim re-examinations, safe harbor, which is referring to use of income determination from other programs. We're going to be discussing an increased amount in the standard deduction for elderly disabled households, as well as an increased dependent deduction. We're also going to be talking about and referring to additional income exclusions that have been added. There has also been a threshold change for claiming medical and disability expenses. There is also a hardship exemption option, which applies directly to the threshold changes related to claiming medical and disability expenses. And there is now a higher threshold for imputing asset income. Next slide. So in each of these sections, we're going to be going back and forth to what does the HOTMA rule generally say about the certain topic area? And then the next slide will refer to how does that rule affect the HOPWA program specifically. So what is the HOTMA rule? Here we go again, Steve, HOPWA. What does the HOTMA rule say about interim re-examinations? Well, what happened was the HOTMA rule clarifies that the threshold for a PHA owner or grantee, and grantee is highlighted here because grantee in this context refers to HOPWA grantees. So we wanted to highlight that so you know. So what this rule did was it states that a grantee must conduct a re-examination due to a decrease in a family's income if there is a change of 10% or a lower threshold set by the PHA owner or the grantee. So what this did was set a threshold of 10%, where that wasn't in prior information about completing interim re-examinations. Also, it goes on to say that grantees must conduct interim re-examinations if the family has increased by 10% or more, or such other amount established by HUD through notice, or a lower amount established by the PHA owner or grantee. The interim re-examination piece of the HOTMA rule also discusses about a reasonable time frame for processing and completing an interim re-examination. And generally, this should be not longer than 30 days after the changes of income are reported. And in addition, it also goes on to outlining the effective dates for any changes in rent due to an interim re-examination. And it goes into detail about how an increase in rent, the effective dates related to an increase in rent, and the effective dates related to a decrease in rent.
Heather, I've had many fears of this HOTMA HOPWA acronym. Challenge, I've been practicing, so here we go. Let's see how this goes. So as Heather mentioned, right, we're going to be talking about what HOTMA says. Then we're going to cover how HOTMA applies to HOPWA. So when it comes to interim re-examination changes, in summary, HOTMA makes changes to HOPWA regulations and includes some of this detailed information that Heather covered about when an interim re-examination must be conducted due to changes in family adjusted income and composition, the threshold amounts triggering those interim re-examinations, and the grantee's responsibility to adopt interim re-examination policies procedures, as well as the date requirements for rent increases and decreases for when people need to pay more or less of their share of rent. But as we mentioned earlier, right, a lot of this is going to come out in the implementation notice, right? So we just want to make sure you're aware of all that's coming, particularly for those of you who have policies and procedures around this, to be aware that there's going to be more that's you're going to need to worry about, right? So you can't just say we have interim policies, we're good. You'll need to really follow that notice that comes out to make sure you are applying HOTMA to HOPWA. Now I'm just saying it to practice it.
Right. But not only that too, what is really different about this for the HOPWA program is now that HOPWA regulations will be updated to include language specifically about interim reexaminations, whereas current regulations don't include that language. So it'll provide more direction and clarification. So going on with the same theme that we've been doing, the next slide is about HOTMA specifically. So safe harbor and use of income determinations from other programs. What does this really mean, right? So HOPWA allows for using the annual income calculation information from other means tested public assistance to determine a family's annual income for that specific program prior to applying income deductions. And the income deductions are the things like mandatory income deductions, elderly, disabled, childcare, medical, dependent, those types of deductions. The HOTMA final rule actually includes a list of some of the types of public assistance programs that other programs may rely on for if they choose to use an income determination from another program. And the list is here.
So what does that mean for HOPWA? HOPWA grantees may determine a family's pre-deduction income based on income determinations made by other means tested, meaning those programs have income requirements to be eligible. So they are collecting income documentation and verifying that through their own process, right? So you can pre-deduction income based on those other means tested federal public assistance programs within the previous 12 months. But note, HOPWA grantees will not be required to use this method. Once again, more information on how to implement this will come forth in the implementing notice.
So this is a great opportunity. So you'll have other ways to, verify and document annual income. So it's an option, it's not required. Increased standard for elderly and disabled households. So what does the HOTMA final rule say about this? What happened? HOTMA increased the standard deductions for families where the head, co-head, or spouse who is elderly or disabled or a person with disabilities from $400 per family, and it will be increased to $525 per qualified family. So right now, for all our HOPWA attendees, when you're calculating portions of rent, when you're determining adjusted income, you're using that $400 deduction because a person with HIV qualifies their family for the disabled deduction described here, that $400. So this amount will be increased to $525. And remember, that's one amount per family, not per each family member. This amount is set for 2024, but this standard deduction will be adjusted annually for inflation and rounded to the next lowest multiples of $25. And this is something that HUD will do.
And what I did want to note for those of you following along, you're seeing citations in the title. So what you're going to see is the citation to either HOTMA or to where HOTMA is changing cross-cutting rules. And then moving forward, we start to have citations for HOPWA. So as Lisa mentioned earlier, the changes to 574, right, the HOPWA regulations. So you'll be able to start to line up different federal regulations and where those changes might occur, similar to that previous chart.
And can you go back one, So here, 24 CFR 5.611, this is where those income deductions are right now. So those will be updated to include information like this, going from 400 to 525. Sorry about that.
No worry. Whenever we get to cite federal regulations, I'm all about it. So what does that mean for HOPWA, right? So as Heather said, right, so this increased amount will apply to the HOPWA program to 2024 and the increases when you're doing rent calculations. So that means, right, that you're going to have to be able to adjust your rent calculations for the 525 and be able to follow along as HUD adjusts those annually to also change those rent calculations as HUD will instruct you to.
So there will also be, along the same lines, we're talking about mandatory income deductions for when the household qualifies, or if you have household members, family members that qualify. So the next one is the increased dependent deduction. The HOTMA final rule says that they will adjust the current $480 per dependent deduction annually for inflation, which will be rounded to the lowest multiples of 25. So there isn't an amount yet. But as you know, when you're doing rent calculations now, if somebody, if there's a person in the family that qualifies as dependent, you're giving that family a $480 deduction per each qualified dependent.
Absolutely. And later in the presentation, we're going to circle back to that definition of dependent. So sort of try to keep all of this loop together. And if not, when you get the slide deck or review this on the HUD Exchange, you'll be able to connect all those dots. Because for the HOPWA program, clearly we're covering it. So this new increased amount will apply to the HOPWA program for what activities that require a rent calculation. So when you adjust income to tell households what their share of rent is, that also means that any changes or adjustments that will happen annually per dependent also need to be changed in your system or whatever rent calculation methodology you use so that you can give assisted households the proper per dependent deduction.
Additional income exclusions. So what did the HOPWA final rule change about income exclusions? Well, the HOPWA final rule they clarified some existing exclusions and they included a few new ones. So you have some of your usual suspects like low income, like LIHEAP, low income housing assistance program, employment income of a minor, somebody under the age of 18. And as far as clarification, HUD thought it necessary to clarify what non-reoccurring income means. So if anybody who's been doing rent calculations for a period of time, I think non-recurring temporary income has been a stumbling point for most folks. I see Steve's like laughing hysterically. What does non-reoccurring income mean? So non-recurring income was clarified to mean income that will not be repeated in the coming year based on information provided to the family. Further, they decided also to clarify that income received as an independent contractor, day laborer, or seasonal worker is not excluded from income under this paragraph, even if the source, date, or amount of that income varies. So it's not automatically a type or job that is related to non-reoccurring income. And I think that will definitely help practically and administratively when you're calculating portions of rent.
So what does that mean for you all listening, right? So you all will have to use this expanded list for income exclusions when determining income eligibility for initial and continued assistance. So for those of you who have done the HOPWA income and rent calculation training, for those of you that have done HOPWA TA on this, particularly when we cover income exclusions, we always refer to 5.609B because the list of excluded is much too long usually to go over in technical assistance. So this is yet another key point to keep in mind that your program is going to have to be able to connect some cross-cutting regulations or reference regulations such as 5.609. So at any given time working with the client, particularly after these changes, you may not be able to know all the exclusions. And as Heather said, some of the ones that have always been there will be there. But at least that way, right, you will know you're going to have to review that for a period of time in case there are new or different ones or changes between what's included or excluded.
So threshold for claiming medical disability expenses increase. What did I almost said HOPWA. What did HOTMA change about this? HOTMA increases the allowance for unreimbursed health and medical care expenses from 3% of annual income to 10% of annual income, phased in over 2 years. Also note that the term medical disability expenses is changed to instead be called health and medical care expenses specifically. There is also a general description of health and medical care expenses, and as explained here on this slide, which can include any cost incurred in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or payments for treatments affecting any structure or function of the body. Health and medical care expenses also include, which might be really common for what you're doing now, right? Include medical insurance premiums. Sometimes those premiums are withheld from Social Security disability payments or Social Security SSI payments, and long-term care premiums that are paid or anticipated during the period for which annual income is computed.
So for HOPWA, this new increased amount, this change from 3% to 10% will apply to your HOPWA program, particularly for those HOPWA activities that require rent calculations. Because once again, this is all about adjusting income when you're doing a rent calculation. So you'll have to be able to adjust that amount as well as that definition that Heather just went over, right? So what many of you think is medical disability is going to change just a bit, and then that definition. But this is definitely another place that information and how to implement this change, because that percentage change, and particularly that 2-year phase in and what to do with that, will be information that's in the implementation notice.
Absolutely. Because the increase from 3% to 10% generally means that you need to have more unreimbursed medical expenses to be able to benefit from the actual medical expense deduction itself. So that's the reason for the phase-in period. Hardship exemption. And the hardship exemption is also tied to the 3% and 10% change. A hardship exemption is an exemption that allows for more expenses than allowable to be deducted from a family's adjusted income for a limited period of time. There are 2 categories to the new 10% threshold for unreimbursed healthcare expenses: a phase-in for families already receiving a deduction for expenses over 3% of their income, and a general hardship exemption. Also, a family whose eligibility for childcare expense deduction, if that is ending, they may also request a financial hardship exemption to continue a childcare expense deduction. And of course, this is nuanced, and there's a lot more. This is high level.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say, Heather. So we're slowly but surely wading into deeper weeds. So right, just remember, this is that high level, right? More information in TA will come out. As we keep bringing things up, if you have specific questions about HOTMA or HOPWA as we bring it up, please throw it into the Q&A. That will definitely help drive those future materials that come out. So for HOPWA and hardship exemptions, HOPWA grantees may, but are not required to, make their own determination on whether to grant a hardship exemption related to the changes to health and medical care expenses threshold, and the child care expenses deduction for a family whose eligibility for the child care expense deduction is ending. So remember, right, Lisa had mentioned this earlier when she covered about when she went through the flow chart of how we got from that rule that went out down to the implementing notice. And there is that one more step that we pointed out about grantee policies and procedures. So there's going to be a number of places where grantees, those who are directly receiving the funds from HUD or HOPWA, are going to need to make some decisions and put things into their policies and procedures. And so some of these things that are detailed about the hardship exemption will be in that implementation notice and will be things that grantees are going to have to think through and operationalize in those policies and procedures. If a HOPWA grantee implements a hardship exemption in their program, there's certain requirements that the grantee must follow. So the grantee must follow the requirements of the revised federal regulation 5.611C through E about this. So we won't go into details of this, except for sort of note once again, right, where HOTMA, almost did it myself, HOTMA is really specifying some things that weren't necessarily always clear across all programs. And so because of that and changes to those regulations, HOPWA is changing their regulations. They'll implement that notice and you'll change your policies and procedures. But to use its authority, once again, the grantee must develop policies and procedures for qualifying and granting hardship exemptions in accordance with those requirements. So once again, it will be key to grantees.
And this CFR reference, again, this reference specifically is about adjusted income. So 24 CFR 5.611 is related to the mandatory income deductions.
And all of that you'll find in the HOTMA final rule, which Amy so graciously put in the chat. So once again, if you didn't see that or want to pull that to look through later, right, you'll be able to look up some of these changes and see where exactly that outlines and what it says in 5.611C through E.
So a higher threshold for imputing asset income, everybody's favorite subject, assets. So what did the HOTMA final rule change? HOTMA raised the imputed asset threshold from 5,000. Remember, you had to impute if the total cash value of net family assets was over 5,000. You had to look at the actual income, but then you needed to do this calculation to figure out what the imputed income amount would be. Now that threshold changed to 50,000. So this is in hopes that there will be less administrative work regarding imputing income from assets. Note that in general, income from assets is considered income. So that income that's generated, right, through interest rates or return on investments. And if it's possible to calculate actual returns, then that amount should be used. If it's not possible to do that, then imputing assets must occur based on the current passbook savings rate as determined by HUD. When the family has net assets over $50,000. So HUD will be setting that current passbook rate. Then it will be adjusted annually for inflation.
As Heather said, everyone loves talking about assets. If everyone definitely loves talking about imputing assets, right? So how does this apply to HOPWA? So HOPWA programs do not have to impute asset income unless the cash value of net family assets exceeds $50,000. So as per usual practice, though, for the HOPWA program, income from assets is considered income. And if possible to calculate the actual return from an asset, that amount should be used. If it's not possible to calculate a return on an asset, imputing income from assets must occur, right? Based upon either the current rate, or as we're talking about, this is now going to apply when the family has net assets over $50,000, which will be adjusted annually. So good news, everyone. We're not going to go into great detail about assets or how to impute assets. There's no secret slide in here that we're going to go into next. So if us covering all that really sort of made your head spin, you have questions about assets, you have questions about imputing assets, please refer to the HOPWA income and rent curriculum that's published on the HUD Exchange. So that will need updating for when HOTMA implementation will occur. It is currently correct. So if
As
you
of
do,
now, yes.
right. So if you do have questions about assets and imputing it, there's a lot of information there. There's some great examples to really make sure you're doing this correctly now before you have to worry about doing it differently when HOTMA is implemented.
So now we're on to section 104. Remember, because only section 102 and section 104 of the HOTMA final rule apply to the HOPWA program. Phew, right? Only 2 sections. So what type of information is included in section 104? Well, here we're going to be looking at asset limitations, exclusion of retirement and educational savings accounts as assets, and self-certification of assets under $50,000. So what does the HOPWA final rule say? Again, we're doing the same process we were doing in the previous section. So HOTMA imposes a $100,000 asset limit for eligibility and continued assistance. There was also some language too about property restricting eligibility for assistance based on ownership of real property.
So this asset limitation applies to HOPWA at initial and continued eligibility for HOPWA activities that require rent calculations. So this is once again one of those things that the implementing notice will really help you think through about when certain things apply, right? Because it's not just always for eligibility, it's not for every HOPWA activity. So this means asset limitation does not apply to HOPWA STIRMU, PHP support services, or housing information. So HOPWA grantees will need to update their policies and procedures for asset limitations and how to handle situations where a client's assets are over the limit, including the ownership of real property. So that information about how to do that, their policies and procedures, what real property means, right? All of that will be part of that implementing notice. So once again, do not worry yet. We just want to make you aware of those changes that are coming.
Right. And remember, like Steve said, and here on the slide, it doesn't apply to STIRMU, PHP, supportive services, or housing information services. Only to those activities that require rent calculations. Exclusion of retirement and educational savings accounts. What did the HOTMA final rule say about this? Essentially, what this does is retirement accounts and educational savings accounts are not part of net family assets. So this is something that you would exclude as an asset. And this is great because this enables people to keep more of their earnings and something that they have been planning for and putting away in savings that is not counted as an asset.
All of which applies to HOPWA, right? So as part of determining income eligibility and calculating portions of rent, both of those that Heather mentioned, the retirement and educational savings accounts, are not included as part of assets. So the HOTMA final rule, as well as the implementing notice, goes into a little more detail about what those ideas mean and help define them. But as Heather said, it really is the idea to help families keep some of that money that they've put aside in savings for these two types.
So what about self-certification of assets? Now, this is a great one, and this is meant to also reduce some administrative burden and, day-to-day operational function. HOPWA allows for HOPWA. And there I go again. HOTMA allows, not required, self-certification of net assets if estimated to be at or below 50,000, of course, adjusted annually, like we mentioned before. So self-certification can be used in these situations.
Which applies to HOPWA if a grantee elects to
Right.
do that self-certification. And saying that $50,000 threshold will be adjusted annually. So, so as Heather said, this is a great thing because it reduces some of that administrative burden. So for those of you, for your households that have assets and you're trying to get verification, third-party verification first, and you're working your way through the priorities, right? At least automatically, if your grantee elects, you can't allow them to self-certify. But once again, more information will be in that implementing notice.
So here we have some definition updates. So these are either new definition or revised definition. One big one is the definition of annual income is changing. So the definition of annual income is currently in 24 CFR 5.609. And it's being changed and updated for clarity. As you know, HOPWA regulations cross-reference and refer to the definition of annual income. So annual income will now read, the definition will read as follows. So annual income with respect to the family, all amounts not specifically excluded in paragraph B of this section. Steve mentioned that earlier, paragraph B, it's not a paragraph, it's several paragraphs of all the types of income that are excluded. So annual, all amounts received from all sources by each member of the family who is 18 years of age or older, or who is the head of household or spouse of the head of household, plus unearned income by or on behalf of each dependent who is under the age of 18. And when the value of net family assets exceeds 50,000, the actual returns on a given asset, either those or the imputed amount on those assets using the current passbook savings rate. Notice here that the definition of annual income is significantly smaller because now HUD is focusing more on what is not included in annual income instead of what is included in annual income. Is this one me? I think so, yeah. And just some other, clarifications to some definition. Earned income, the definition is a little bit longer than this in the HOTMA final rule, but generally earned income means income from income or earnings from wages, tips, salaries, other employee compensation, and self-employment. So what is unearned income? Any annual income that's not earned, right? And then here we repeated the change and clarification of non-reoccurring income, which is income that will not be repeated in the coming year based on information provided by the family, and then goes on to explain that income received as an independent contractor, day laborer, seasonal worker is not excluded from income under this paragraph specifically. So it's not excluded as non-reoccurring income, even if the source, date, or amount of that income varies.
I think that's particularly important to highlight because as Heather was talking about earlier, why I was laughing, this idea of non-reoccurring income and what that means, but particularly where some of this starts to say what it's right. that idea of you could be an independent contractor, a day laborer, or a seasonal worker, because sometimes we see programs that will automatically exclude income for someone who's a day laborer or a seasonal worker, or even an independent contractor, because they think it's non-recurring. Right, so this is really then trying to clean that up and sort of specify that alone is not a reason you would not include these this income source.
In addition to, it's important to mention the HOTMA final rule does include a list of examples of non-reoccurring income sources and types. And there are also, which we didn't include in this presentation because we're already, over 50 slides. There are definitions of independent contractor, day laborer, and seasonal worker too in the HOTMA final rule.
That's not a reason to read through the HOTMA final rule as soon as this is done. I
don't
don't know what
is.
is. That alone is a sell to me. I might just click off and read through it right now. All right, so let's go over a few other changes to definitions. So the first thing to sort of preface, right, is so once again, these new and revised definitions were definitions that are now for all of the programs that fall under HOTMA. So some of these things that we've talked about and we'll talk about now aren't totally new or different for a HOPWA. It's just making it more uniform. So for example, the HOTMA final rule also includes some new and revised definitions for foster children and adults, as well as a dependent. So as a reminder, while foster adults and foster children are members of the household, right? So therefore, those individuals will be considered when determining an appropriate unit size and utility allowance. They are not considered members of the family. So if they're not considered members of the family, that means you wouldn't include them for purposes of determining either annual income or adjusted income or net family assets, whether for eligibility or a rental calculation, or it's a re-exam or an interim. So nor are the assets of foster adults or foster children taken into consideration for the purposes of the asset limitations as we previously covered.
And
right,
why is that? Because the definition of annual income itself speaks to the annual income of a family member, not household members specifically. So it's just clarifying that.
Right, so that's just to help clear that up and remind people, right, they're definitely part of the household, so they should be used to determine an appropriate unit size, but you would exclude those individuals for all the things listed there. So as Heather mentioned, right, the income included is for a family. So as we keep talking about a dependent is a member of the family. So that means it excludes foster children or foster adults other than the family head or spouse who is under 18 years of age, or is a person with a disability, or is a full-time student. So the definition of dependent for what you should be doing now isn't changing operationally, it's just helping to clarify this for a number of other programs. But to hit this idea that a dependent isn't just those who are under the age of 18, it's under the age of 18 or a person with a disability or a full-time student, as long as they're not the family head or spouse or a foster child or a foster adult.
Right.
We keep talking about the definition of family, so let's go over that. So when the definition of family, HOTMA is making a conforming change to the definition of family to align with the language in the HOTMA rule itself. So specifically, it adds to the definition of family youth who are between the ages of 18 and 24, who have either left foster care or will leave foster care within 90 days, and who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless at age 16 or older, will be considered single purposes or single persons, my apologies, right? So the current HUD regulations at 5.403 do not include the separate category as eligible youth within the definition of family. So this updates that 5.403, which then will also then help update the HOPWA definition of family. Once again, stay tuned for the implementing notice for more information on these definition changes and how they may or may not affect your program. I said, so some of these really aren't going to change your day-to-day HOPWA program, but some of the other HUD programs that we talked about earlier, it will.
So to be mindful of time, we're going to go through some other HOPWA program change highlights that are included in the HOTMA rule: net family assets, resident rent, earned income disregard or EID, and a few other additional changes. So I think what I wanted to talk about here was just a little bit more about net family assets, and make mention that net family assets do not include the value of all non-necessary items of personal property with a combined value of $50,000 or less. HUD will issue guidance for PHA's owners and grantees to determine whether an item is a necessary item of personal property and whether the value of that item should be included at all when calculating net family assets. The HOTMA final rule revises HOPWA regulations at Part 574 to apply the Part 5 definition of net family assets. We discussed that earlier. Except the value of a home of a participant receiving short-term mortgage and utility assistance or other home ownership assistance under HOPWA is excluded. So net family assets, the value of the home itself, if somebody's applying for and receiving STRMU, the value of the home is excluded from net family assets. Resident rent, the HOTMA final rule clarifies some language around resident rent requirements. And here are, a side-by-side of the current regulations, how resident rent requirement reads, and how it will be adjusted in HOPWA regulations. You'll notice that in the second part here under D1, there is some information, they're removing some information about 5.609, 5.611, and 5.617. 5.617 is the regulation that refers to earned income disregard. So I encourage you to, after this presentation, just read through this carefully, but it's ultimately still the same. You're going to be calculating portions of rent, and except for persons in short-term supported housing, the rent payment shall be the higher of three options. Option 1, the rent payment, including utilities, will be 30% of the family monthly adjusted income. Option 2 is clarified as 10% of the family's monthly income. And option 3, which applies if the family receives welfare assistance. That remains unchanged. And you can see how that is worded here in D3 in the current regulations.
Let's talk about earned income disregard, everyone, or EID. So when the rule first came out, HOTMA, it talked about programs getting rid of EID. This has come up with some grantees and sometimes in the AAQ. So just real quick on today's presentation, we're not going to discuss in detail what earned income disregard is or how to implement that for now. If you do have questions about EID after today as a project sponsor, reach out to your grantee, or you can submit a HOPWA AAQ, and we're more than happy to give you some guidance for how to implement it now. But this final rule reinstates the requirement that grantees have to stop using EID. So this means HUD's removing the requirement to allow EID, and this will apply 2 years after this implementing rule takes effect. So what does that change mean practically? That means what you have been doing to screen persons and eligible household members for earned income disregard should absolutely continue through December 31st, 2023. Don't stop screening people for EID. Don't stop giving people that benefit for which they are eligible and should receive. For those who are deemed eligible for earned income disregard as of December 31st, 2023, those persons will continue to receive EID for 2 years. Exactly as it's implemented right now, there are no changes for how you will carry out those 2 years of earned income disregard. EID will be completely phased out on December 31st, 2025 at the conclusion of that 2-year allowance, right? So on that last slide, we talked about you have 2 years to phase out EID. So for anyone who qualifies as of December 31st, 2023, their EID will clearly end December 31st, 2025. But because of that implementing date of January 1st, 2024, no new persons can qualify for earned income disregard. So your programs will have a period of time for people who are on earned income disregard and receiving that benefit, and individuals who are not eligible, right? Because it's no longer allowed for the HOPWA program. Once again, if you have questions about earned income disregard and EID and what you should be doing now and how to implement this, please reach out to your grantee or submit a HOPWA AAQ. One last idea to go over: third-party income verification. So HOPWA regulations will be changed or updated to detail requirements for obtaining and documenting third-party income verification, consistent with the provisions of the HCV program, right? So this will align HOPWA requirements with the HCV program to the extent practicable. HUD's aware that there are some systems that HCV uses that HOPWA cannot. So there will be some differences and they won't perfectly align. So that's why we're talking about to the extent practicable. But this is another place where that more information and implementation of third-party income verification for HOPWA will be included in that implementation notice.
Right. And in the meantime, take a look at the HOTMA final rule, specifically the section that updates HOPWA regulations at 574.310 E3.
That's a lot, everyone. We get it. We appreciate you for sticking it out. We're going to go into a few more things, but as we start to round our time, right, and come to the end, just to keep encouraging people, keep submitting those Q&As, right? We definitely aren't going to have a lot of time for Q&A at the end, if any, but your questions about HOPWA and HOTMA will help drive everything that comes next. So please continue to ask. So what can you all do now, today, or potentially tomorrow to start preparing for HOTMA? Stay tuned, right? If I had $1 for every time I said that implementing notice, I'd be a rich person. So stay tuned for more information about HOTMA, about webinars, office hours, tools, and products. So make sure you send up for the HOPWA listserv. So the hyperlinks here when you get this slide deck. Most of you are at least getting emails from the HUD Exchange. Stay tuned to that. But this HOPWA listserv is through HUD.gov. So that way you'll have two email sources about when some of these things will be implemented. Start to look at your HOPWA program and especially your rental assistance program's budget and design to make sure you can implement HOTMA. So review your budgets to ensure that funding is available for training, learning opportunities, and for staff to prepare and update their policies and procedures, forms such as intakes and applications, whatever rent calculation items that you use, right? So that you have time to look over that and learn it. We would also encourage you to look at your HOPWA program staff structure, including the number of staff and staff responsibility, right? So depending on the size and design of your program, you might need to add HOPWA funded staff to assist with changes due to HOTMA. So as that reminder, right, if you're charging HOPWA overhead staff time, that should be charged the applicable activity. So as you look at your budgets, project sponsors, if you have questions about your budget size and if there's that room, reach out to your grantee to start planning any changes to your contracts now or future contracts that might come out. And then particularly with annualizing income and rent calculations becoming more technical, right? Think about all of those topics we just went over and adjusting annually to make sure that you have the staff with the skills, training, and resources need to actually implement these changes. Because ultimately what we're talking about is making sure people and families are eligible for the program in the first place. And for those that are receiving rental assistance, that they are paying the correct and proper portions of rent. So consider reviewing your HOPWA program design to include to strategize this, right? Are the right people with the right skill sets doing the right portions of HOPWA? Continue to use your HOPWA guidance that you currently know and love for annualizing income and rent calculations, right? So once again, no changes until it takes effect. If you've not yet start reading the HOTMA final rule because of the heavy pitch that we've made and our excitement for it, you can start to review that now just so you get a sense of where HUD overall is going. There are some HOTMA fact sheets on the HUD Exchange that talk about how some HUD programs, like the HCV program, how they're implementing HOTMA. But be aware, right, that some of those the implementation between HCV and HOPWA may be different. So once again, don't make changes, but there is some information out there to really start you thinking through some of the details of this. And then look for those emails for what's coming next for webinars, office hours, tools, and products. Okay, everyone. Let's see who's still around, who's still paying attention, who hasn't totally tuned Heather and I out. I'm going to launch one more poll. So similar to what we did for Inspire, now that you have this high-level overview of this regulatory change, we want to know the types of HOTMA training tools, resources, other things that would be helpful for your program to implement this.
So when Steve launches this poll, please take a few minutes to, this is a well, long answer. It's a fill in the blank. Please take some time to, give us some ideas of resources and things that would be helpful for you.
And I will plan on leaving this open through the end of the presentation, right? So if you just need a moment to collect your thoughts, I'm that kind of person. List something once, feel free to keep going back. With that, are there any Q&A that have come through that we are able to answer today?
I think that I will toss that to HUD's Office of HIV/AIDS Housing. I know that Lisa and AB have been furiously addressing some of the Q&As that have been submitted. So I'm thinking probably not. We'll have to wait for the implementing notice itself. But Lisa or Amy, do you think this is something that will need to wait, or are there any questions we could address live right now? And if not, that's totally fine.
So I can say there are a lot of really good questions that are coming through.
I saw, yeah.
And I'm not going to address any specifically, but I do want to say, just the fact of how folks are thinking about these new requirements. We are. A lot of this will be answered in the implementation notice as we talk about how to operationalize these. So it is coming soon.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate that, that, there will be a lot more information coming out very soon.
Right. That's great. And I saw that there are a lot of, they're really great, thoughtful questions. So I think that can inform a lot of things as we're thinking about TA going forward and the implementation notice. So keep the questions going, because those are absolutely useful later.
And we'll also note that there are some questions about program design and rental calculations and things now, but those are all the questions that, for those of you who submitted those, we'll follow up, right? Because as always, it's only good TA if we ask some follow-up questions to actually be able to address it. So thank you for those of you that have submitted some questions about things that are occurring today.
So if you want to move to the next slide, we can.
Yeah, the only
begin
other Q&A that I think is easy and safe to answer, I saw it come up a few times, as that reminder as we wind up, today's materials will be posted to the HUD Exchange, right? So you'll get this slide deck and this recording. You'll know via email that it has gone out, so that you can continue to review this and prepare your program.
So in closing, stay tuned for a couple other HOPWA webinars that are occurring in July. One is next week, and then the week after. We have the HOPWA HIV aging series, using facility-based housing to address needs. That is occurring on Monday, July 24th at 1 p.m. So if you haven't registered for that, definitely do that. I'm sure there's going to be some wonderful information during that webinar. In addition, the following week on Monday, July 31st at also 1 p.m. Eastern Time, there will be an overview of the Violence Against Women's Act, VAWA, and HOPWA. So again, two other webinars that are occurring in July. Next slide. And as always, to get assistance, or if you're, need some answers about HOPWA in general, please, you could always request HOPWA technical assistance. Grantees that are in need of TA can submit an online request through the HUD Exchange at the link found here. And if you're looking for some quick policy and operational answers, you could also submit a question, to the HOPWA Ask a Question or AAQ desk. Grantees and project sponsors may ask a question through the AAQ, and that link is also provided here. And also, as we close out, I want to again thank everybody. How's the poll doing, Steve?
I just closed it. Okay,
great. I wanted to thank everybody for attending. I know this was a lot of information. It was high level. I know you really want some detailed operational information, and I completely get it. That will be forthcoming through the notice, and additional TA opportunities and tools, products, and resources. Anybody from OHH? Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Just real quick, I just want to echo what Heather said, particularly for everyone listening. In many parts of where you are, it is unbearably hot or is unbearably wet, and you are dealing with a lot. So once again, thank you for carving out 90 minutes to learn a little bit about HOTMA. Not enough as you want, but we really do appreciate your time and all the hard work that you do.
Any final words from HUD's Office of HIV/AIDS Housing before we sign off for the evening?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks everyone for your active participation, and for all of the great questions that we will absolutely be, following up on and using to inform our guidance. And we really just appreciate all the work that you do.
Thank you all again, and stay tuned to the HUD Exchange, and you'll know when the recording's available. Have a good evening.